Nigeria's easing inflation rate for January 2026 signals a gradual cooling of price pressures. Headline inflation stood at 15.1%, down from 15.15% in December last year. Now, on a month-on-month basis, prices dropped by 2.88% compared to a 0.54% increase recorded in December. Food inflation also showed a more notable improvement, with year-on-year dropping to 8.89%, a sharp decline from 29.63% there in January 2025. And a further breakdown shows that both urban and rural areas recorded lower inflation compared to a year ago. Joining me now to discuss this in a lot more detail is Bemi Alonge, who is a public policy analyst. Bemi, good morning to you. Many thanks for joining us on the show.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're most welcome. All right, let's begin with headline inflation easing to 15.10%. Would you consider this a real turning point or just statistical relief?
So it's welcome. It's a welcome development. However, it's a mix of both a turning point and statistical relief. So like you said, the statistics are a big part of the inflation that we're seeing now as a result of the change in the rebasing year from 2009 to 2024. So, and a lot more methodological changes, for example, the use of short-term relative index rather than long-term, which means that the basket of goods that is now being used to measure inflation can change from time to time depending on the reality of consumption within the country, right? And the base effect is also a big thing, right? So apart from the fact that the rebasing was done, Nigeria, from 2022 to around 2024, the inflation, month-on-month inflation, increased to about an average of, say, 2% to 3%, from around 0.5% to 1.2% before then. So we saw a significant or a rapid increase in inflation, especially month on month, in 2020, between 2022 and 2024 than we had seen before. So prices were extremely high already, right? So we had a situation where any change that was made would make such a big impact, or any development, any decline in prices, or even, slow down in prices. It wasn't really a decline. So would make such a big impact on the way that we calculate inflation. And finally, back to the methodology, what makes up the basket of goods that is used for inflation has also changed, right? And weights attached to them have changed. For example, in the new methodology, food makes up just about 20%, less than 30% of the food basket, whereas it made up to 50% of the food basket prior to now. Things like some of the nomenclatures of even the baskets or the groups of things also changed. For example, before there was a category called restaurants and hotels. Now it's called restaurants and accommodation, to sort of take into consideration other alternative rental accommodation like shortlets and things like that. Also, communication has a bigger portion, and the accommodation portion, or that category, also has a bigger portion or a bigger weight in the inflation basket than before. Also, communication, and essentially is more reflective of what's happening today. So the statistics make up a huge part of why we're seeing these significant improvements. However, food inflation, for example, and I'm sure we'll still talk more in depth about that, saw a big improvements last year as a result of the rains. So obviously the weather was, there was a lot of rains last year, and that made an impact. So, there's a bit of, statistical changes, but also a genuine decline in the pace of inflation so far.
Quite a myriad of factors based on what you've just said. And of course, categorically, as you mentioned as well, we see quite a few changes there. We also saw a sharp negative 2.88% month-on-month drop there. How unusual is this, and what drove it?
So, in January is usually, if you look at Nigeria's inflation, the seasonal trend is usually like January, April, May, and then August. Inflation declines, right? So this is usually as a result of seasonality. So in January, for example, we're coming off a high from the festive season where people typically would spend much more than usual. Yes. And then, in January, things slow down a bit. But also we see a situation where even in December, spending was not as much as prior to then. In cases of like food and things like that, the price of items were not as high as they usually were. Some of the factors that could be responsible for this could be like the exchange rate. Around sometime, throughout last year, it was pretty stable, hovered between 1,300 to 1,400. Pretty stable relatively stable compared to like where we're coming from, where it was pretty volatile years before then. So importation was a lot. Imported inflation was somewhat stable as a result of that. We also saw, generally that kind of stability sort of seeps into other factors. We also saw transportation somewhat stable as well because of energy prices. The energy prices, while they changed, they were somewhat predictable. And we've seen a situation where the knee-jerk reactions that we saw in 2023 as a result of the removal of petrol subsidy has sort of stabilized. So people are now, getting used to the idea that the prices are no longer fixed and they could change. And even though those changes will be reflected in the inflation now, they're not as drastic because of the expectation. There's more predictability in the market. So I think, again, the seasonality is January. People don't spend as much as they do in the festive season. And there have actually been more predictability and stability in key areas where that would typically like tip off or trigger inflation in the country.
Right. Now, speaking of that, you touched on food inflation earlier, and you of course alluded to a lot of volatility back then, and of course a bit more predictability now. Let's talk about how in real terms this is translated in the Nigerian market, for ordinary Nigerians today, because many might still question the stability and predictability you speak of.
Yeah, so first thing is, a decline in inflation or disinflation does not mean prices are reducing. Yes. It just means the pace at which prices are increasing has slowed down. So that's one thing. So if I'm sure when people are listening, they might think, prices
there's an immediate expectation that we see a drastic drop.
Exactly.
Many times, yeah.
More often than not, we wouldn't see a drastic drop in prices, at least not in the immediate, right? But the pace at which prices are increasing would reduce. Now, coming back to food inflation, in 2025, the weather was a bit, it started off well, but after a while, it rained for most of 2025. Yeah. So that meant that farmers, which usually contribute to the food basket of the nation, which usually depend on rain-fed, they operate rain-fed agriculture, got a lot of rains. Now, that meant that there was also a glut in the market, right? So there was a lot of production. They were able to harvest and all of that. Although there was still it was still a bit unpredictable for them, right? I know I'd mentioned like predictability with regards to FX and things like that, but for the farmers, it wasn't predictable because they had a situation where they got rains whether or not they wanted the rains. Usually, the way the farmers plant, they're usually like farming cycles or planting calendars where there are periods of time when they actually farm, and then afterwards they sort of expect the sun to sort of dry out their produce and things like that. They didn't get that. However, there was actually a glut in the system for most food produce. So not all foods, because there's some that actually require more sun than rain, and those who would usually produce that didn't get as much sun as they needed. Now that led to a glut in the market. There was a lot of supply in the market, and that was why we also experienced. So I'm sure people would have experienced as well that the pace of increase in December was not as high. December 2025 was not as high as usual, or as high as we have historically seen. So that signals what they were, the experience of farmers, as a result of the rains.
Right, got it. And certainly this also plays a role or spillover effect into the disparity we see between urban inflation and rural inflation. Yeah. You've just alluded to farmers and seasonality generally, but could you just paint a brighter picture around this difference between those two, the gap?
So urban inflation and rural, I mean, if you look at the weights of the baskets even, urban inflation makes up over 70% of inflation in Nigeria as a whole. And that's because urban areas are just more expensive and they're more reactive to price changes than than the rural parts of the country. So prices are likely to be tipped off, and even specific factors or specific categories of the sector, the baskets usually would see more increase in their prices than others, right? So the urban inflation, yes, that was expected. Parts of the nation where, that make up the urban, parts of the country, especially during the festive season, they see a boost because there's more spending, there's more, so obviously it will still remain high. It will still remain, again, inflation. When we think about inflation, there are also portions of the inflation that are much higher. So for example, when we think about inflation, we are either talking about headline inflation, which basically is everything together, makes up or takes into consideration all the different food baskets, or core inflation that basically take out the more volatile categories like food and energy, right? But if you look at the core inflation, it actually increased. So that speaks to the fact that while things like food could see a decline as a result of the glut in the market or the excess production last year, other key sectors still saw an increase. Like inflation was still pretty, I think it was around like 17%, so still pretty high in those segments. So inflation, we're not out of the woods yet. That signals that, there's still a lot of work to be done to tame inflation in Nigeria, despite the methodology changes and everything. It's still pretty high and it's increasing. So key sectors are still witnessing, a spike in like the increase in price increases in the market.
Right, certainly. And, quite right, core inflation 17.72%, remaining elevated there. But let's look more now at the regional disparities. Of course, we saw some states post higher inflation than others. So let's get a bit more granular about those regional disparities. What's driving that?
So that's typically driven by, first, we can't compare. The NBS would even advise not to compare states against states. Yeah. So rather what we'd look at is the month-on-month inflation increases within those states. And there's some states that were doing up to 4%. There were some that were doing over 3%. And that's pretty high. So and unfortunately, there was no region where, we couldn't pinpoint, this is the region where we're seeing more increase. It was literally different parts of the country, whether it's Cross River, Jigawa. So we're seeing this spread of inflation, high month-on-month changes across the country. And that could be as a result of, specific issues going on within those states. For example, insecurity is still a big part of it's still a big trigger of inflation. When there's insecurity, access to goods and services are just not as easy. So it's more expensive to actually access goods and services. People taking goods and services towards those regions are also less likely to, if they feel like they might be threatened, their lives or the goods that are being transported might not get there safely. They might sort of stay away from such places. There's also the issue of the climate. Like I said, we got a lot of rains last year. Now, with the rains come inaccessibility to some regions. It comes flooding. One thing that while we're happy that production may have increased for a lot of farmers, what we tend to not think about is what that means for storage. Nigeria doesn't have sufficient storage capacity. When there's a surplus in the market, farmers are forced. So there's very little opportunity for them to sort of save for the rainy day. Ideally, when there's a glut in the market, farmers should be able to save some for, the future and the possibility of, if there isn't enough, right? They don't have that capacity. Some don't have enough storage. Some don't have the right kind of storage, right? So, for example, with the rains come humidity, things could spoil easily and all of that. Even transportation, some of the trucks that move farm produce across the country, they're not exactly refrigerated trucks. They're not covered. As they're moving around, the rains.
And lots of waste as well.
There's a lot of waste across, like moving from farm to market. So those are some of the challenges that may also cause certain states to not have as much, or to witness a significant spike in inflation more than others, especially when sometimes even the states that are food producing that see an increase in their inflation more than states that aren't. So those are some of the issues that, the weather, insecurity, those are key issues, even tourism, right? So with an inflow of like a lot of more tourists into the states, there's some states that in December, they experience a lot of tourism, and those price increases don't change immediately, right? They don't leave when those people leave. So in January, some of the residents or some of the indigenes of such states still experience or sort of grapple with the price increases. Those are some of the challenges.
Those are the stark realities, in fact. And, in light of all this, you mentioned earlier, we've concluded that transport and food contributed quite heavily to price movements. Which sectors in light of this should we be watching the most closely?
Food, food, transportation, again, the restaurants and accommodation, because it now makes up a significant portion of the weight in the inflation basket. Also, development sectors, healthcare, education. By the time we see education and healthcare, inflation in those sectors increase, those could have very dire impacts on Nigerians, on everybody. If inflation in healthcare, for example, the last between 2022 and 2023, we saw, like the exit of a lot of pharmaceutical companies out of Nigeria, and that's significantly impacted the health sector and led to a lot of health inflation. So medication wasn't very accessible. So those are sectors that we also need to keep an eye on. While they don't make up as much of a portion of the food basket or the inflation basket as other sectors, they have severe impacts on Nigerians. So those are sectors that we also need to keep an eye on.
Right. So speaking prospectively now, could this disinflation trend reverse in the coming months? What's in your crystal ball?
Certainly. Unfortunately, they could actually reverse. Yeah. And I'm going to take it back to food again, because, while it's reduced, the portion of the weight has reduced, it's still the largest component in the inflation basket. Last year, the rains were a lot and very unpredictable. When farmers expected the sun, they didn't get the sun as much as they expected. Now, what that has led to is those farmers have been unable to sort of store as much as they should. Some of these farmers that depend on rain-fed or that practice rain-fed agriculture also rely on the sun to dry out their seeds for the next planting season. Now, with rains still persisting, they're unable to dry out their produce for the future, and that would mean that they would have to depend on buying seeds from other places. If you buy your seeds, you really can't predict what kind of seeds you're buying. That could also have an impact on the future. So essentially, the food prices are at risk this year, because last year was good, the rains were good, but they were not very good for farmers who wanted to preserve seeds, especially grains, for planting in the new season. So they weren't able to preserve their seeds. They don't have seeds to plant this year. They weren't able to store the excess they had last year. So that also has a big challenge. And usually, even the unpredictability of the rains. It's been raining in January. That's very unusual for Nigerians. So even the farmers don't know when to start planting, when to stop drying. They haven't even gotten enough sun to dry out their seeds and things like that. So we shouldn't be surprised if we see prices of food increase this year, because farmers are just unable to predict.
Lots of uncertainty there.
Another thing is, now that our energy prices are market reflective, if there's any increase in crude oil prices globally will feel the impact.
Absolutely. It's very important that you note that.
Yeah.
Which you just...
So those are key factors that may reverse, and they're very likely because, I mean, without severe intervention for farmers, for example, or even in the energy markets, this could easily reverse the trend.
So one might ask, what does this mean for interest rates and the central bank's next move?
So I suspect the central bank, because core inflation remains high and it's still increased, I suspect the central bank would want to hold. Another thing to also mention is we're in a pre-election year, so a lot of campaigning is already going on and will likely continue. That influx of money into the economy would also probably make the central bank cautious. And as a result, while, headline inflation has reduced, we expect that, I suspect that the central bank would want to hold off to see the trend sort of sustained over time, especially now that spending in the economy would increase, and in light of other key factors that could reverse the disinflation. So they'll likely hold the interest rates in, I guess, the next decision, and then maybe if we continue to see a disinflation, especially in the core components, they might then start to reduce.
So we certainly wait and see. If you joined us midway, I've been chatting with Bemi Alonge, who is a public policy analyst, and we've been discussing Nigeria's ease and inflation rate in January 2026. Bemi, it's been an absolute pleasure, a very insightful conversation.
Likewise.
Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again very soon.
Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome.